Okay, thank you again, everyone, for joining. My name is Claudia Loaiza, like Professor Garcia had mentioned, and I'm working in partnership with my colleagues here, including Corey, Travis, Justina, Carrie, Kristen, Ronnie, and Valerie. And we are working on a multi-phase project again to understand the effects of exclusionary zoning and displacement within Salt Lake City, as well as investigating some existing efforts to challenge these things. And it also identify some paths to greater equity within the local context. So today we're going to be presenting some of the key findings of our first phase of engagement, which was aimed at understanding the problem and establishing a baseline of how displacement has formed and perpetuates in our city. So we'll start off with the next slide, which is going to be on the historical context. Awesome. And we really want to frame this conversation with talking about that historical context surrounding housing displacement. And this is really going to provide a more comprehensive understanding of some of the indicators and contributions to this reality that we face today. So with that, we do want to acknowledge that Salt Lake City and its history is very much a story of opportunity and haven seeking, and as well as a conflict of ideas and values. And it's really important to acknowledge, the original stewards of the land, which are indigenous populations, those that reside, those that have resided, in what is now Salt Lake for over a millennium, specifically the Ute, Shoshone, and Goshute tribes. And the population continues to kind of thrive today, especially through some nonprofit and frontline service organizations like the Urban Indian Center that provides some key resources to the community, and something that kind of goes along with what we hope the thread of this entire project will be, that we continue to engage community assets and partners that can help us inform the work in a more equitable way. And then also, part of this history is related to the Latter-day Saint pioneers, and alongside the Plat of Zion that was kind of used to establish the grid system network that we navigate today. As well as the immigrant communities that continue that search for opportunity within Salt Lake City, especially through large projects like the Transcontinental Railroad that was built in 1869, and that connected Salt Lake City really to the rest of the US and the world. And that kind of opportunity really brought on a lot of innovations like the trolley, which was an extensive form of transit and transportation at that time, and connected people across Salt Lake City as well through Ogden, northern and southern kind of parts of the county. And these immigrants, largely from Eastern Europe, China, Japan, and Mexico, created those, ethnic pockets, pockets of ethnic-based neighborhoods, some of which we still see remnants of today. But, a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment and exclusionary land use regulation is what perpetuated some of the displacement and the gentrification of those areas. So really wanting to set the tone about how we need to acknowledge the past to move forward to a more equitable future. And to go into a little bit more detail about our built environment and how it was formed, you can go to the next slide. So the Plat of Zion was essentially, the document, which you see on the left here, the original Plat of Zion, created by the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is Joseph Smith. And it was in an effort to create a spiritual utopia, essentially. And it was really based on massive blocks. Right now, especially in Salt Lake City, we can see that, there's 660 feet blocks on each side. So even just walking the length of one intersection to the next, you're walking the length of a football field. And that has brought on issues with walkability, traffic congestion, and also, some issues with capital investment. But you can see kind of in this aerial image, just how large those blocks are, and how that continues to affect the way that we navigate our spaces within the city today. And into the next slide, there's another image that you can see that shows just kind of the vision of how, the Plat of Zion creators wanted Salt Lake City to be as populous as a place like New York or Philadelphia at the time. But really, try to infuse infrastructure, education, and community, with the home being kind of like the center for the city fabric. So that's kind of where that idea of privacy, single family dwellings, and that inclination to, have that large amount of space to build out and subdivide. But according to some historians that we've been looking into and researching, these, large blocks that were designed this way, it was under the expectation that it would be subdivided, that it would be broken up into smaller units as the city evolved. So it wasn't always meant to stay, the rigid urban grid that it is right now, which is an interesting kind of perspective to bring into this. And going on to the last slide, or the next second to last slide on the historical factors, it kind of goes into that idea that a lot of these milestones within kind of the land use story that we have within the city have had these systemic contributions. So what you see here is a brief timeline of key land use events that have resulted in these systemic contributions to the reality of the built environment that we have now. And I won't go through every single point, but it's really formative milestones, like I said, regarding the Plat design, which resulted in those massive blocks that still kind of proved problematic for walkability and effective capital investment. And also, redlining was a key event that formed these, racial and income segregations within our city. And I know that Justine is going to talk a little bit more about that, but it's going on to things like post-war industrialization and urban renewal, including the construction of I-15, further aggravated that lines of division and set the stage for further pricing out of certain groups. And coming into more contemporary time with COVID, exacerbating health inequities and socioeconomic inequities, and also resulting in higher mortality and infection rates, specifically on the west side of our city. There are many forms of historical factors that have contributed to some of the issues that we are exploring within this class. And that also goes to show with like the eviction moratorium ending, the eviction rates that we're kind of perpetuating throughout the pandemic and continue are concentrated on in neighborhoods and zip codes along the west side. But we do acknowledge that the hope and efforts to curb these effects are also being city led. So things like the partnership project that we're doing now, and then also alluding to the Salt Lake City Racial Equity Plan that we've been made aware of as well. That's hopefully slated to release in the near future. So there are many different pockets of opportunities that we're hoping to kind of capture within this project. And then there's 2 more slides I think that you can go on to, Justina. And this is really quick, just kind of like an overview of the historical build out of the city. It shows that the development period was really starting from the center and radiating out to the margins of the city over time. And what we want to emphasize in this slide specifically is that the communities on the west side have always been there and always been a central fabric to the city area, but the development phases of things have shifted. And I know when we were talking just as a group, we were acknowledging that Rose Park, for example, a neighborhood back in the 70s maybe was considered middle class, it's largely an more affluent area. And over time, just obviously things that those historical factors that we talked about have come into play and affected the thriving environment and the upward mobility of certain groups. So we hope to just really understand how growth can be managed better, more equitably and smarter, and therefore achieve more fairer outcomes and resource distribution across the city. And then just as a last slide here we go. So just going in and ending with this redlining history and the lines that divide idea. I believe most of you probably know that what you see here is a redlining map created for Salt Lake City by the Homeowners Loan Corporation back in 1939. And the goal of this was to really assess high risk areas, and the risk being graded neighborhoods ranging from A being best, B still desirable, C definitely declining, and D hazardous. And this impacted really disproportionate amounts of Black, Latino, and immigrant communities during this time, and limited their ability to buy homes or receive loans and accrue generational wealth through this really key appreciation of asset. And thank you for that resource that I see in the chat right now. But really overall, it's led to a stark divide between the east and the west side, with the west having a higher concentration of our BIPOC underrepresented communities, and that unequal division of resources. But I think something stark here is to just recognize that this might have been the foundation for a lot of racial and income segregation. And again, moving to kind of the more contemporary context, it has had that longstanding legacy on health, welfare, and community assets. So we're hoping that we can continue to unpack this with you today and go into maybe more of the details on what is kind of the current moment of housing and affordability and displacement. So I'll pass it back on to Justina.
Thank you. So the next section, I'm sorry, this slide is to benefit the other students from other campuses who might not know much about Salt Lake. It's just showing that Salt Lake is bounded by mountains from both sides, which means it can only build out so much. But to build on what Claudia just said, in this section, I want to show that the legacy of redlining is still alive. To start off this section, I just want to establish some basic facts about Salt Lake City. This is 2020 data showing that median household income is about $64,000, which translates to per capita income of about $40,000. About 40% of households make less than $50,000, and 14% of the population is below poverty line. We're also very car dependent community. 70 people, actually more than close to 80% of people drive to work, and it takes them on average 20 minutes a day. But just to remind us one more time, the redlining map, because what we'll see next is that those lines really still exist. So if we look at income, I mean, you can see that the areas that were redlined before coincide with the lower income areas today. More importantly, this really is where the population is most diverse. Minorities live pretty much in areas that have been previously redlined. And the same true for age distribution in the city, meaning that younger people, which are defined people under 20 and 18, live in the west side of Salt Lake, and mostly in the areas that actually the highest concentration of youngest population is in areas that previously had been redlined. So, well, this is just to remind everyone that we're a very car dependent community, and even though we believe that there is transit in the city, it's mostly used by the students and the university. And this is something that leads us to this conclusion that the areas that we've just shown you, that were redlined, that have lower incomes, that have younger populations, that are racially most diverse, those are also areas that are most vulnerable. And I know that more people will want to talk about it because there's a lot to say, because it is a very troubling idea. Claudia, I thought you wanted to comment on it as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so with this slide, it was mostly just to kind of talk about how there are multiple ways of quantifying vulnerability and how that can be problematic at best too when you're assigning a number to a lived experience. And I know that when in conversation with some of our interviewees, there was, that challenge of how do we make the process more equitable and empathetic instead of just focusing solely on efficiency. So I know that the State Department of Health has created a health improvement index, which is used to assess vulnerability and disparity at a local area, so neighborhood level. So I just wanted to add that basically, we'd like to explore more and, hear your thoughts too on how we're able to balance that empathy, efficiency idea when it comes to, understanding what the needs are of a community and what a vulnerable experience is. So that's all I wanted to share. So thank you, Justina, for giving me the time.
Next section moves more into the housing market. So we understand what we're talking about. What is the housing situation in the city or in the state, as a matter of fact? So I'm starting off with a slide that shows Utah in large. And the key thing to take away from this slide is the fact that there is a shortage, a housing shortage of about 50,000 units in the state. But the population is growing so fast. Utah is the fastest growing state in the US. The population is growing so fast that it's virtually impossible to catch up. So this is a major challenge going forward. But also and due to that, prices are growing really, really quickly. When we look at the price of the average house in Utah a year ago and today, the price has grown by 23%. If we move to closer home to Salt Lake County, we see that the rent prices have gone up by 200% within last 20 years. And housing prices, home prices, went up by more than that, by close to 220, 230%. When we look at Salt Lake City, these are the prices that I checked for today. The typical home value of homes in Salt Lake is $565,000. And the average rent level as of today is $1,394. So, I mean, they're high, they're extremely high. They've grown by more than 15% or 20% just since last year. A fact that we need to keep in mind that the state and the city and the county are growing really fast. As I mentioned before, Utah is the fastest growing state in the US. The fastest growing county in Utah is Utah County, but Salt Lake County has grown by 12%, probably more than that because the data is for 2010 to 2019. But just last year, in 2020, Salt Lake City's population grew by 13,000 new residents. We build a lot. There's certainly a construction boom in Salt Lake. And the share of apartments being built is growing immensely. But I just want to quote a comment from APA Utah Legislative Committee that said that if the pace of building units does not speed up, even though we're building so much, it will take still 20 years to close the housing gap. And that housing shortage has driven up housing prices and rents and created a serious housing affordability problem. The shortage has also excluded many from home ownership, added to substantial increase in doubling up of households, delayed marriages, and discouraged young people from forming new households. So even though we're building so much, the population is growing so fast, it's like we're never gonna catch up. Part of the issue is the minimum wage in Utah, which is $7.25. Well, some research I was able to locate showed that to be able to afford a home in Utah, you would have to make at least $18, $19 per hour. Also, to be able to afford a home, to buy for it, you would have to make, this is data from 2019, you would have to be making $70,000 a year. But just considering today's data, which is that a home costs close to $600,000, which translates to $2,500 in mortgage payments every month. That means that a household would have to spend $30,000 on a mortgage alone. And keeping in mind that a median household is $63,000 and that actually 40% of the population makes less than $50,000, owning a home is unattainable for most of the people in the city. This is further showing housing options in the city. And close to 90% of the acreage of the city is covered by single-family homes, leaving less than 10% to multifamily developments, of which only a fraction is devoted to condominiums. And there's another trend that I noticed that I think is very interesting, is that when you look where the areas where the city population has grown most for the last 10 years is along I-15 in this corridor. But this is also the area that's zoned for general commercial. What is happening is that there's a large number of new apartment buildings being built along I-15 in areas zoned for general commercial. Why? I just have some hypothesis, but it is interesting to me that it is located right by I-15 in a general commercial zone. And this is where the population is growing the most. Now I will just hand over to Victoria and Carrie, and they will be talking about what we found out through the interviews that we have conducted.
Thanks, Justina. We were really lucky in just the wealth and breadth of knowledge of the people that we interviewed. We have 10 interviews so far. We did reach out to several more, but getting on people's schedules is a little bit difficult right now. We broke it up half and half. We have half that 5 were part of local governments and 5 were in either nonprofits or private businesses. And they really covered the whole gamut. We went from covering homeless services and outreach to actually building the units, to the policy of how they get built and how we plan and how they affect the neighborhoods and what that looks like for the communities there. And so in order to try to synthesize all of this information, we used an online whiteboard app to put everyone's info in and be able to look across it to see what was similar and what was different and what stood out in each one, which we'll dig into a little bit more on the next slides. But I really encourage you guys, if you have the chance, to read through our report when we publish it, because there's just so much information that our interviewees gave us that is impossible to cover in the span of this short presentation.
Okay. Yeah, I got to unmute myself. So there were definitely some underlying themes in our interviews in reference to how people or why people are being displaced from their homes. One of them was the overwhelming demand that's happening that has kind of been a topic of our presentation so far in general. Just the amount of people that need housing and especially affordable housing is so high that the demand is so high that rents are going up. There's also not enough new or existing affordable housing to support the number of people that need it. Many of the older multifamily buildings are not old enough for historic preservation efforts, nor is there enough funding to support that cause. And they're in poor condition, so they're being torn down. And unfortunately, these buildings are the main source of naturally occurring affordable housing. And the buildings that we are replacing these naturally occurring affordable housing buildings with are usually going up and being market rate. And if they include affordable housing, it's usually a small percentage of the units are considered affordable. And then another thing that is contributing to displacement are public investments that are increasing property taxes and affecting homeowners as well as renters through increased rents. One of the quotes from one of our interviews says that we know the city is coming in and investing in high frequency bus route. We're putting in a new sewer line. We're putting in all new street trees and new street lighting. What is that doing to the people who live there? Will it raise the property values that will push them out? Is it going to cause a new development to happen there? And how do we mitigate that displacement, that involuntary that could potentially happen? Despite all of this, there are still many underutilized homes that are taking away from the supply of housing. These include properties being used as Airbnbs, part-time rentals, or properties that are just sitting vacant. I know one of our interviewees was hoping to be able to take action on that in terms of taking that property and either being able to like renovate it, use it again as a home, or create more housing in those locations. But there's also been a lot of frustration with the part-time rentals and Airbnbs that are taking up units that should really be for residents. Another thing that is, of course, leading to displacement are individual hardships. So loss of income, especially with the COVID crisis, ailments in mental health, drug abuse, or previous evictions on record, all make finding housing extremely difficult for people dealing with those hardships. Okay, next slide.
We found several barriers that exist currently in creating affordable housing. One of the most popular ones that comes up both in our interviews, but also just across the board, if you're reading any newspaper articles, any news articles about affordable housing, is the idea of NIMBYism, or not in my backyard. One interviewee spoke largely about how affordable housing is not just a Salt Lake City problem, it's a regional problem. Salt Lake City is just a small blip in this larger region. And so the idea of NIMBYism comes into play not only in like, how do we support affordable housing across all the areas of Salt Lake, but how do we support affordable housing regionally across Utah? And what does that look like in terms of how many people do we have working in Park City, but living in Utah or living in Salt Lake because it's more affordable? And we'll get into that a little bit later. Funding is a big concern for many, whether it's the restraints and limited availability of federal funding, like the low-income housing tax credits, the rising building costs, or the fees involved with going through the drawn-out approval process. The longer approval process was also an issue just because of its relativity to the building costs. So the longer the process, the higher the costs get. The less units they would be potentially able to build at the end of that process. For permanent supportive housing, we did find a difference there that requires continued funding after construction, and financing these operating costs were an even higher concern. One interviewee talked about using Medicaid and how to find that outside of Salt Lake. Zoning and land use ordinances also did not match up with the current growth of Salt Lake. One interviewee talked about the future of zoning, and if we're looking at, if we're only allowing a small percentage of Salt Lakers to live on this land, is there a really great reason for that? Since we do live in a valley, zoning is very interesting here because we can't continue building out. And so we're going to have to be smarter and more flexible in what that looks like in the future. And yeah, that's it for that slide.
Okay, so this slide talks about a few different things that are all connected. So projects and policies that may spike displacement. One of our interviewees stated that I think maintaining the status quo is probably the worst thing that the city can do. So there's a lot of push to change how we're we're dealing with this situation. Currently, we're tearing down existing affordable housing, like we talked about before. Again, the city investments, and there's also a push to transform motels into more official affordable housing. However, a lot of people are already using those places as affordable housing, and in making it official, there's more of a process that goes into being able to live there, whereas right now it's a little bit more easily accessible for the people that need it most. Another thing that is spiking displacement is just the current practice of creating more units at any cost. The demand is so high, and I think there's a huge push to create more units. However, one of the interviewees felt that there needs to be more thoughtfulness involved in where we're placing those and what the impacts are to the community, and also if we are displacing people that already live on that land. Strict single family zoning, of course, spikes displacement, as well as we cannot build on that land in more of a multifamily way. And then also poor access to homeless resources. If we have monocentric care locations, people need to stay in that area in order to access those resources. The hardest hit neighborhoods, according to our interviewees, are mostly the west side, so Rose Park, Glendale, Poplar Grove. There's also mention of Ballpark and Central City. And then there is also the comment of TSA zoned areas. So anywhere along the tracks line are seeing a lot of development and a lot of displacement as well. Populations that are most at risk, renters for sure. Also those that lost their job during COVID, areas with low homeownership rates and low job opportunities, students, seniors, and young families, and racial and ethnic minorities that have not had the time to build generational wealth or own property.
According to our interviewees, there's no current numerical data that reflects the prevalence of displacement. And I see there are people in the chat updating us with some others. So if anyone here right now has a link or knowledge on that, we'd love to hear it. None of our 10 interviewees really had any numbers to show for that. But we did have one that mentioned that the positive side of our market exploding the way it was that their neighborhood homeowners are seeing a rise in equity that they haven't ever seen before. And so they're taking that newfound wealth and they're saying, yes, this is great. Like, we have new opportunities that we haven't had before, and they're being able to move outside of the city. And so we're really seeing that the path to housing stability is home ownership. And so how do we support that across the city? And then what does the city also look like if those people that are able to leave those neighborhoods and move out, who is moving in? And are we keeping our city as diverse as it has been, or are we creating more of a homogenous city population? And what does that look like for the future?
So another topic that was brought up is the community assets that we have that are also losing their ability to stay where they are. So rents are rising for residents, but also organizations and small business owners. And there's mentioned that there's a little bit of a lack of consideration of what those assets are before rezoning or creating new development in that area. So small businesses are not able to stay where they are as well. And then there's also kind of a lack of protections on historic buildings, which are typically more affordable for renters. Okay. And then one of the quotes that we have is that it's not a binary of you either need to provide affordability or you need to care about communities that historically have not had basic amenities getting them. You can provide both, and typically that's what we look to do.
So we spoke to both city officials as well as private businesses and nonprofits. So many of the answers to these two overlap. To touch on a couple, because I know we are running out of time, collaboration across the departments and organizations in Salt Lake was key to stabilize communities, especially if we begin to collaborate across county lines to address the larger scale housing crisis. Also, nonprofits and developers are building more affordable housing and looking at new opportunities to increase the density and decrease the inherent construction costs. And while we're able to keep these costs lower, we're also able to pass that on to our renters. Meanwhile, the city has been loosening up on zoning requirements and adding options. ADUs factored heavily in a lot of our interviews. Some of it was really positive in that we are allowing it to be built, and some of it had more opportunities in how we are funding the ADUs, and then their restrictive design ordinances and whether or not that was actually pushing people away from adding that to their properties. Also, we have a lot of funding that has been offered long-term and emergency. Another part that came up was form-based zoning in like the central 9th area, and a quote about that was, form-based zoning has brought a really great dynamic mix into that community, and you can see the product is that the area is booming and growing. It's a great healthy mix of commercial, single family, and multifamily. It's just wonderful. I think there's a lot that can be learned from those target areas, those samples of where we did form-based zoning. And Kristen just mentioned it a little bit. I see someone is mentioning it in the chat on out-of-date zoning and NIMBYism and how that's tied to design requirements or lack thereof. One of our interviewees did talk about the loss of the historic buildings, particularly on 400 South, where you're seeing a lot of podium builds and glass and steel going up. And so one of the things that came out of this discussion was, is there a way to incorporate both the future of development, what that's looking like, and the older school architecture in order to make our downtown areas, our city, something that's both like walkable in terms of football field blocks, but also walkable in that you'd want to look and not just see, you know, the glass walls of what they mentioned would be a parking garage or a fitness room for, especially for apartments that are out of reach for a lot of our renters. Next slide.
So the interviewers that we spoke with had a lot of great ideas in terms of what they need to succeed. One of the main points that was brought up was having a more holistic approach and collaborating between different organizations. I know that a lot of people have kind of switched over to doing that, and so far it seems like it's been pretty successful for them. And what goes with that is kind of increasing that communication between different organizations creates a mutual understanding in terms of what is needed and how to make that happen. Another point was brought up that we need more community involvement in the land process so that planners have a more thorough understanding of the community's needs, but also what their assets are, so we don't lose those in the process. Another point that was brought up was adopting a right to counsel program in which the city pays for legal representation for tenants in eviction court in an effort to prevent evictions. The city currently funds tenant landlord mediation programs. And I think, let me see if I can find a quote from this. Yeah, I know the city has been also kind of in that holistic approach concept, kind of bridging the gap between different organizations and kind of reaching out to them and seeing what they can do, even if the city itself can't do anything themselves. There's also the need to have better messaging to the more affluent communities, that they play a big role in terms of rejecting or allowing more density in single family neighborhoods. So again, that NIMBYism, trying to mitigate that and see what we can do in terms of creating more density, even if it's slightly more density in those single family neighborhoods, to help increase availability for housing. There was also mentioned that we need more case managers for affordable and transitional housing, just to help people get from a place of either being homeless or having unstable housing situation into a more stable situation. And that ties along with that is a more gradual decrease of support structures as individuals gain more wealth, rather than kind of a drop off. So people can work to improve their situation without being necessarily abandoned by the support structures that are helping them right now. And then, of course, more access to flexible and discretionary funding. So providing a mix of dedicated funding, flexible funding, market adaptable and responsive funds, affordable loan products, and rent products for affordable housing. One of the quotes in relation to NIMBYism says that educating people, presenting opportunities to pose, how can we work with you to not be demanding they get out of your area, in reference to homeless people and encampments, and providing more of an understanding as to why someone is being displaced can help with the housing instability. Okay, next slide.
To jump on that last slide too, one of our interviewees mentioned, actually a couple of our interviewees mentioned the need for incentives for developers in order to build more affordable housing, if there's tax credits or other things that can increase their profits. Those are often tied up in red tape and processes. And if there was a way to, when developers call and say, hey, I'd like to make this, I'm making this new development, I want to add a floor of it to be affordable housing, what can you offer me? And giving people, the city officials or whoever is on the other end of that phone call, the autonomy to be able to say, yes, it's great, this is what we have to offer, was another thing that was really important. But again, we covered so much ground in these interviews, it was impossible to distill it down into just a few slides. So we'll finish up with possible anti-displacement policies and programs. And one of our interviewees, their quote was, what if you had to pay $100,000 for every affordable unit you took out? Maybe we'd start to end up with some serious money. And so the idea of, if we incentivize developers to build, can we also take the flip side of that and make it a cost penalty to take out those affordable units? And we looked at both displacement policies for housing, renters, and policy. And to even begin to start closing our housing gap, we need to be creative and flexible in our housing methods and policies. Currently, we're exploring density, diversity, and types of units offered, adaptive reuse policies, and multiple use buildings integrating housing and community assets. One of our interviewees mentioned that our neighborhood that she's in has lost their pharmacy for housing, and both are things that the neighborhood needs. And so if we start to look at more multi-use buildings where we're putting a pharmacy in the bottom and offering housing on top, what does that look like to the quality of life for the people in that neighborhood, both the ones living in the housing and also in single family homes or other multifamily around it. For renters, we found that there is short-term funding and support for month-to-month living with income restricted units or housing vouchers, but currently there's nothing to support renters in becoming homeowners. One of our interviewees mentioned the median wealth gap between a homeowner and a renter, and the homeowner's net wealth was about $250,000, And there are federal programs that help support home ownership and subsidizing that and increasing that stability. But the median net wealth for a renter was only about $6,000. And the federal support for that was just month to month. Currently, there's nothing to help build equity for renters, to help stabilize them, or even move them out of income restricted into a market rate unit. And then lastly, on the policy side, the city has been looking at several updates. Our chat has been talking about many of them, from zoning changes and demolition fees to flexibility for allowing developers to add new types of units like the ADUs, co-living, SROs, which is a single resident occupancies, and also micro units. And so by decreasing the floor size, the size of the unit that's being built, we can decrease the construction costs for it without relying on federal government support, which we found that LIHTC is great, but there is just not enough of it to support the growth that we're seeing in our city. And then also flexibility for developers to speed up the permit process. Typically, one of our interviewees talked about development being kind of a murky process. And so if we can clear that up a little bit, can we have more developers in the pool building? And can we also get those buildings up quicker without degrading the safety or the building codes of them, but just to cut the red tape out and get more housing for more people, so that one of the interviewees talked about the Salt Lake City government really wanting everyone from every strata to be able to live in Salt Lake if they want to. And the more quickly we can get housing up that suits every different income, the quicker we can get all those people to be part of Salt Lake and part of the fabric of our city, and really like working in towards our economic stability as well. So the holistic approach is that it all just ties together.
All right, so in summary, we explored the historical context of Salt Lake City to illustrate the urban fabric, because it truly does relate to the present land use and how people are moving through the city. We went a step further by directly showing the current demographic, spatial patterns, and overlapping it with the historic redlining map. And so, as you already saw, and I'm sure you already know, the current spatial patterns are still influenced by various policies and land use decisions from the past. It is truly not a surprise saying that the social complexities are uniquely intertwined with the housing crises, and this housing crisis is and will continue to disproportionately affect certain demographics of people. Through the interviews, we have been able to bring forth several voices from people that work in the sector daily, and that make an impact on this issue. Their feedback was insightful in learning the realities and factors that contribute to the housing crises in Salt Lake City. So with that being said, our work will not end at the conclusion of this presentation. We will have 2 more parts we plan to undergo. The second part, we will be analyzing the current policies in place at the local level. The third and final part, we will be making recommendations to implement considering today's presentation and our future findings in part 2 of the project. So with all that being said, I would like to open up the floor for questions and comments.